Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. We're really delighted this evening to have one of our most distinguished professors at Rice, Gale Stokes, share his expertise with us on the most pressing and tragic issue in international affairs today. Gale Stokes, who you know is the Mary Gibbs Jones Professor of History at Rice University, has been with Rice, started as an instructor in 1968, and has been here for a long time. But he's not as old as I am, so he's chaired the department in several times. He is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a fellow at the Institute for Sino-Soviet Studies at George Washington University, has received various distinguished alumnus awards, and in 1994 received the prize for the best book in the field of Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, awarded by the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. And he's written several books, fascinating and excellent books on the issues impacting on Eastern Europe. 3 Eras of Political Change in Eastern Europe, published by the Oxford University Press in 1997. The Walls Came Tumbling Down, very well known. The Collapse of Communism in Eastern Europe, that he published, was published by the Oxford University Press in 1993. And From Stalinism to Pluralism, a documentary history of Eastern Europe since 1945. And that was published in 1991 with a second edition in 1995, and there's much more. But Gale is a very brave man. He has volunteered to explain to us what is happening in the Balkans. And he has even been courageous enough to not only talk about the quagmire, but as we put in our press release, to even talk about possible solutions. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Gale Stokes, Dr. Stokes, to the podium to talk the Balkan Mess background and solutions. Gale.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think that the solutions part, I'm afraid I might get arrested here for false advertising because I'm not so sure I'll be able to give some solutions. But I do want to, at the last part of my talk, say something about what I think stability in the Balkans might mean someday. Usually speakers, or often they may start by saying how happy they are to be here and how happy they are to see you all here. Today, that's not the case. I'm not so happy to be here, and I'm not so happy to see you here, because we're here to discuss a very serious and debilitating problem, a human disaster, and a political quagmire of a serious extent. These events in Kosovo, of course, are only one event out of a whole series of events that have occurred since the collapse of communism. They're going on, in a sense, all over the world, nationalist and ethnic-related struggles of all kinds, Rwanda, firestorms in the Soviet Union, Sudan, many other places in the world. It could be a very long list. And scholars have looked at these issues, and they've looked at the question of nationalism and ethnic conflict. And in fact, in the last probably 20 years, more important work has been done on that subject than in the whole previous history of investigation of these issues. But somehow or other, it hasn't been particularly satisfying. Nationalism has proved a difficult nut to crack. It's frustrating to get a grip on. One of the reasons, I think, is that it's so pervasive, and we explain it in ways that seem successful to us at the time another generation comes on and explains it in a different way. And the terrible events in Kosovo have only exacerbated, I think, our sense of frustrations. I think most people are astonished at Slobodan Milosevic. He's been willing to trade devastating bombings of his country for the right, it's not a right, but for his action, to push hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians out of Kosovo. And whether one is enthusiastic about NATO policy or not, Milosevic's defiance seems almost incomprehensible and certainly not quote-unquote European, because over the past few decades, Europeans have come to think of their part of the world as stable, fundamentally stable, based on capitalist markets, democratic procedures. And surely Milosevic's policies must be some kind of aberration, and very often events in the Balkans are described in that way, as those people down there have been fighting each other for 1,000 years, and that kind of explanation. But however distasteful Milosevic's policies may be, and they are, in my view, they are, in my opinion, part and parcel of a long European history, at least 150 or maybe even longer years old. And the first thing I want to do today is to say something about that, some really long-term comments. I'm a historian after all, and I find that events that I am living in are, for me at least, achieve meaning when I understand something about their background. So the first thing I want to do today is talk about really long-term events. And the second thing, I'll try to be brief on these so we'll have some time for questions, is some what I call medium-term comments on just who the Albanians are, what is Kosovo, where it comes from, and then hopefully some current comments on policy and how stability might be able to achieve in the Balkans. So first, what I might call deep background. And by deep background, I'm talking about starting in the 17th century, right? Okay. That is to say 300 some odd years ago. It could even start farther back, because the first point I would like to make in discussing nationalism and why I think it has the characteristics it does for the extremer kinds of nationalists in today's world. The first point I want to make is that a state system was created in Europe before the French Revolution. The relevance of that will become more apparent, hopefully, as I go on here. And in 1500, the world was not organized in a system of states as we think of them today. Intrusive, omnicompetent states didn't exist the way we think of them today. There were states, but they were organized in a different way, and probably not more than 20% of the world was organized with clear-cut borders surrounding them with a certain administrative bureaucracy that dealt with them in 1500. Today, of course, the entire world is organized that way. Every map has a line on it constituting some kind of state that belongs to the United Nations. That's a long process. It maybe started with diplomatic procedures being worked out in the Italian states in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. The 30 Years' War led to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 that established relationships, or a beginning of relationships among sovereign states. This is a new thing, relatively new in the past 500 years, a sovereign state. In medieval Europe, God was the sovereign. Today, the people are sovereign, and this long migration of sovereignty from God to the people, part of that process concerned the constructing of sovereign states, and then a system to contain those states. And without going into any detail here, that process can be said to start, I think, with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And you can draw a kind of a nice, as we would say in history profession, Whiggish line. That is to say, one looking backward, we try to pull out what the right thing to look at is, through the Treaty of Utrecht, through Napoleonic period, and the Treaty of the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, and eventually the League of Nations after World War I, and now the United Nations, in which Europeans, as they expanded around the world with their industrial might in the 500 years from 1500 to today, took with them this state system and imposed it on the rest of the world. I just want to make the beginning point here that the state system existed already by the time of the French Revolution. Now, why do I want to say that? It's because it seems to me that nationalism as we know it today in its more virulent form is an ideology. That is, it's a set of ideas that motivate and mobilize and legitimate. So that I would like to say, I'd like to assay or suggest what the content of that ideology is in a way that is relevant, I think, to the situation we have today. And I'd like to base that on three ideas that come from the French Revolution that were interpreted in certain ways by nationalists. They're ideas that we all know and we all are familiar with. One of them is popular sovereignty. And this is something we all believe. People are sovereign over their state. Today, that's the basis of our society. But of course, it's an absolutely brand new idea. who in fact are the people. Because during the French Revolution, using ideas from the 18th century, put into play, so to speak, into political play, this idea of popular sovereignty, but they didn't say exactly who the people were, because in fact during the French Revolution, women were not considered part of the people, neither were slaves, neither were servants, and so forth. So during Napoleonic period and later, of course, in a period of reaction, the idea was not current, but it was out there in public. And during the 19th and 20th century, political thinkers and politicians started to try and define who the people were. For example, 19th century liberals, in answering the question, who are the people, said those with property, those who have a stake in society. Those are the ones who should be able to vote and constitute civil society. Later, in the 19th century, socialists said, well, what about the workers? What about the workers? They create wealth. Shouldn't they be also part of the people? Shouldn't they get the vote? Then women came along and said, what about our half of humanity? Aren't we people also? Shouldn't we be part of civil society, have the vote? Eventually in the United States, African Americans said the same thing. Hey, what about us? We were slaves, and now we're somehow subjected. In the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement, and hey, we should be part of the people today also. We should be part of the people also. So that over a couple hundred years, the idea that all competent adults are part of this entity called the people. Okay, that's the first idea. Second idea from the French Revolution, and this is a really fundamental one. It's the idea that I call equity. There's liberty, fraternity, equality are the ideals of the French Revolution, but actually, I don't think we believe in equality. We don't, for example, believe that a Supreme Court justice should get the same pay as a county justice of the peace, or that a general gets the same pay as a private, and so forth. We know that in a corporation there has to be people who are above and below, and so forth. So in that sense, we don't believe in equality. But what we do believe in is fairness, equity. The idea of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, essentially, that all men or all human beings are created equal, is an absolutely new idea. I mean, it's throughout human history. Societies have been organized on the notion of hierarchy. It's so clear. Some people are stronger, smarter, richer, maler, than others. And so it just seemed perfectly natural that throughout history, society has been organized hierarchically. But the French and American Revolution put the idea in that there is some sense that people are created equal. Now, of course, once again, the problem was to figure out what that sense was. In what sense are people created equal? It is a problem today. It underlies all the rights talk that we have around us. And it's basically, in our country, it's thought of as being an individual thing. You, I. We have our rights. We insist upon being treated fairly. And it's been a very corrosive idea for oppressive regimes in the last 200 years. That's the second idea. Popular sovereignty is the first, equity is the second one. Nationalists combine these in a unique way. For example, take the question, who are the people? Instead of saying those with a stake in society, women, whatever, they said, we are. We are the people. Those of us who recognize each other for some reason of language or history or religion or whatever, we are the people. But I'd like to point out that, and we are all equal in our we-ness. Everyone is a member of the nation equally. And so we are equal in our we-ness, in our Germanness, in our whatever. But I'd like to point out that that kind of equality is not an equity statement. It is not a statement about equity, because it's not about individual rights. It's a community kind of concept. It's a corporate kind of concept. And as we know, we can see it in Kosovo today, but we can see it in many other points in the history in the last 150 years. Nationalists have no trouble trampling on the rights of others. Why is this? It's because when we define the people as us, we can only do that if there are some people who are not us, who are the others out there. So once we define ourselves as those we recognize as ourselves, it automatically means that there are others that don't count. And nationalists have routinely trampled over the rights of others, minorities, or those that they have opposed. this is also part of the reason I think that nationalism as an ideology really has very little social or economic content. You can be a nationalist and be a socialist, a fascist, a liberal, a conservative, whatever, because it doesn't have much of that kind of content to it. So that's a different concept of what we-ness means. What would equity, I mean, of who the people are. What would equity mean? Well, equity for the nationalist is not an individual idea. It's, as I said, a community idea. These ideas now are taking form in the 19th century. That is to say, within the already existing state system. A third idea of the French Revolution that I want to mention then is the notion of freedom. Freedom was transformed in the 18th century. The idea of freedom was transformed in the 18th century. Before then, in, say, the Holy Roman Empire, someplace like that, freedom meant privilege. A nobleman had the freedom to place a weather vane, on their barn, whereas other people didn't. Or if you were in a guild, you had the freedom to produce the hats within a 20-kilometer range of your town, or something like that. They were privileges, and the head of the Holy Roman Empire's duty, in part, was to sustain the privileges of his nobility, or that is, but they called them the liberties, sustain the liberties of the nobility of that region. Well, in the 18th century, the idea changed. The idea of freedom came to mean the conditions under which stable or government or civil society could take place. What do the nationalists make of this idea? How is the nationalist who is interested in his own group, how does his own group become free or become autonomous? I would claim that eventually, however they start, often talking about autonomy and so forth, eventually they are driven toward the idea of an independent state. Why? Because in the state system, only those people that have independent states, recognized states, are perceived by the rest of the world community as being truly autonomous, as being authentic people. So to be free for the nationalists means to be driven toward the idea of having their own state. Autonomy means independence within the state system. And I think, and I would claim that a good deal, some significant portion of European history in the last couple hundred years is the working out of this principle by remapping state borders onto ethnic lines, of homogenizing the idea of autonomy into the state system. That the nationalist thinks of making we autonomous within the state system, and this has happened for at least 150 years. And we can't go into any detail here, but suffice it to say that if you were to look around Europe in 1830, for example, you would see the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire and the German Confederation, the Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, eventually by French monarchy, and so forth. You wouldn't see a Europe that looked much like today. Then you had the unification of Italy, the unification of Germany into a single state, World War I, which led to the resurrection of Poland and the creation of entirely new states like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and enlargement of others like Romania. During the 1920s, you had exchanges of population among Turkey, Bulgaria, and Greece, in which people who had lived in the same place for 400 years, Greeks, people with Greek names and so forth, living in Anatolia, were just bodily taken over and dumped in Macedonia. Then you had World War II, of course, which really shuffled populations around. For 1,000 years, Germans had been expanding toward the east, and within a space of a year or so, at the end of that war in 1945, millions and millions of Germans went back to Germany, essentially. At the end of World War II, there were 8,000 displaced persons. 8 million, not 8,000. 8 million displaced persons in Western Europe, a huge population movement. What was the result? The creation of increasingly homogeneous states in Eastern Europe. For example, Poland is the best example. In 1920-25, Poland was only 67% Polish. It had Jews, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, and 2/3 Polish. Today, Poland is about 95% or more Polish. Why is that? First of all, the Jews were killed. Second of all, Poland was moved over about 150 kilometers to the left on your map, to the west, taking German lands, ethnically cleansing about 8 million, 7 to 8 million Germans out of that land. Of maybe 1 million of those died in a few months in 1945. And then lopping off the Ukrainian, White Russian, Lithuanian parts. And there we have Poland, an ethnically homogeneous state. A good thing for the stability of Europe. But think of the cost. 2 world wars, really, 50 million dead. This was done by violence. All of the things that I've mentioned, Italian, German unification, World War I, World War II, created a more and more ethnically homogeneous Europe, but at tremendous cost and tremendous bloodshed. And what I would propose to you that what's happening in Yugoslavia in the 1990s is simply a continuation of this process, an effort by the people who are participating in these things, Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Kosovars, and so forth, or Albanians, to remap state lines onto state borders onto ethnic lines. And I know I've talked about in the past, and if nothing was happening in Kosovo today, I would say that it was my prediction, I've made this prediction many times, that the last major event of this kind was going to happen in Kosovo and in the Albanian lands. Why should the Albanians, who constituted roughly 6 million people all over the Balkans, why should the Albanians not have a state of their own? That includes most of the Albanians. That's the question the Albanians, of course, would ask. Which brings me to the question of who are the Albanians. The second thing I'd like to, that was the big picture, right? The French Revolution, everything. Now let me talk a little bit about the the smaller picture, but it's still a pretty big picture. And that is, who are the Albanians, since they are one of the centerpieces of this event that's going on now. The Albanians are kind of a murky background in the sense that there are few historical sources for their very deep background. But it's thought that they are people that were in the Balkans since maybe 2,000 years ago, or even before that, maybe as much as 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. In other words, more or less original peoples living in the Balkans, known to the Romans as Illyrians. They have contributed a great deal to the Roman Empire. Several Roman emperors were of Illyrian background. The great emperor of Byzantium, his name is Justinian, was of Illyrian background. And at the time that the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire were competing for conversions, some of the Albanians converted to Catholicism, and some of them to Orthodox Christianity, Byzantium. But then they were conquered by the Turks, I should say by the Ottoman Empire. It's kind of a point. I try not to use the word Turk when I'm referring to the Ottoman Empire because it was a multi-ethnic state, and even the Sultan himself was, from an ethnic point of view, not Turkish. So I try not to use that word, and I specifically try not to use it because it's a word that Serbs use to refer to Bosnians, for example, and it very much mixes up the actual ethnic situation. So at any rate, the Albanians were conquered by the Ottoman Empire, and about 70% by modern times had become Muslim, which doesn't really sound like much of a problem, because after all they were conquered and there was hundreds of years there in which they were under Islam. The really interesting question is, why isn't the rest of the Balkans Islamic? Because, for example, for 150 years the Ottoman Empire ruled in Budapest. Yes, Budapest, right there in the center of Central Europe, and for 400 years over the Serbs and so forth. We can't go into this in detail, but the reason is that Islam is a religion that honors peoples of the book, that is to say Jews and Christians, because those were Abraham and Jesus were incomplete revelations of God, to which Muhammad gave the complete revelation, and so they honor them as members of the book. And although they treated them as sub-citizens, they called them raya, or cattle, nevertheless they permitted them to have their own church and did not forcibly convert too many people in the Balkans. The Albanians were an exception, and one of the reasons was that they were so warlike. And another is because they started to have success within the Ottoman Empire. Some of the most famous Grand Viziers of the Ottoman Empire were of Albanian or Albanian origin. As far as Kosovo goes and that region, that is the center of the medieval Serbian state. Perhaps you have heard mention of the famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and you wonder why, what, 1389 for heaven's sakes, isn't that a long time ago? Well, exactly the area that is today called Kosovo and around there was the center of a Serbian medieval state, rather extensive, well-developed, interesting Serbian state. Had it not been defeated by the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century, it might have developed into some kind of state like others did in Central and Western Europe. It was defeated. But the center of the Serbian state and the population of the time was in Kosovo, and the people who lived there were primarily Slavic. However, under the Ottoman occupation, substantial numbers of those people departed. For example, there was a very great emigration in 1690 because of military campaigns between Austria and the Ottoman Empire, where 80 to 90,000 persons, or it could be 80 to 90,000 families, that's a little unclear, left that area, Serbs, and emigrated into southern Austria and the area now known as Vojvodina. Many Serbs also fled that region into areas that were called the military frontier. One of those areas is known as Krajina, where in modern times a couple 100,000 Serbs lived within the contemporary borders of Croatia. Those are the people that were ethnically cleansed by the Croats in 1995 out of that region. So there was emigration out of the region, and Albanians, some of whom already were autochthonous who lived there, but also others started to move in. So that by the 1900, the population of the area today known as Kosovo was probably predominantly, or a majority at least, were probably Albanians. Serbia got that region, Kosovo, in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. And you can read today, it's available in a modern edition, the report of the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace that sent observers there to check out what was happening. It's very similar to what was happening today. Horrific stories of Serbian and others, but I'm just thinking of the Serbian today, massacres of Albanians, burning of villages, killing of men, and that kind of thing. Then came World War I. Serbia was defeated for a while, but then its army came back in 1918 and something similar happened. During the interwar period, under what we tend to call today the First Yugoslavia, from World War I to World War II, Albania was just simply part of Serbia, called Old Serbia by the Serbs, in which there was a conscious effort by Serbia to repopulate the region. Lands were seized. There were still Albanians who held their lands, but good lands were seized by the Serbs. There were immigrants, preferential treatment for Serbs who wanted to move down there. And the Serbian Serbs refused to permit schools in Albanian. In fact, they even started to refuse to permit Albanians to go to school at all beyond very beginning grades. Everything was taught in Serbian. This didn't succeed in Serbianizing the Albanians there. In fact, over the previous centuries, there's probably something of the reverse going on. Then we had World War II. During World War II, it's a terribly, terribly bloody, complicated event. Croats massacring Serbs is one of the main parts of that war, but there's lots of other combatants, the Germans, the Italians, the Croats, the Serbs, and the partisans, of course, the Yugoslav communists under Tito. They seized power, as you know, in 1945, and one of Tito's most successful policies, at least in the short term, was his nationalities policy. And the nationalities policy of Tito was to rigidly follow a numerus clausus kind of idea where whatever the percentage of the population was, that percentage would be in the various federal organs. And he recognized, or permitted to be recognized, the Albanians, not, and this might have changed things had it happened, the Kosovars, not as a republic. There were only 6 republics in the former Yugoslavia: Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, but not Kosovo. Kosovo, because of the Serbian long-term interest and ancient sensibilities, almost to a religious fervor, about Kosovo. Kosovo was made an autonomous province of Serbia. And until about 1996, It was ruled with a pretty stiff hand by Serb-led secret police under Alexander Rankovic. Rankovic fell in 1966. And from about 66 to 91, let's say, roughly speaking, there was a resurgence of an Albanian resurgence in Kosovo. In fact, Serbs helped us a lot by sending professors down to Kosovo, to Pristina University, for example, to do teaching. And there was a kind of a fund in Yugoslavia that funneled money into underdeveloped areas, of which Kosovo was a major one, very high unemployment rate there. And the country, however, came to be ran by kind of an Albanian mafia, a Kosovo mafia, that, as was true in many centrally planned economies, used the monies that were pumped in there not really to create employment and that kind of thing, but to line their own pockets to get their relatives jobs and to invest in the great, huge factories that some sort of Stalinist communists like to have. Everybody had to have their steel plant, for example, and so forth. And a lot of money went down the drain, and it really didn't help unemployment very much there. This was a sore point with people, with countries, with Yugoslav republics like the Croats and the Slovenes in particular. They say, well, look, we're getting all this foreign currency here. People are coming to the Adriatic coast. Probably people in this room have spent time at Dubrovnik or other places on the Yugoslav coast. Very lovely places, wonderful places to go. We're making all this foreign currency. It should be invested here in Croatia or in Slovenia, where it'll be used efficiently and effectively. It's throwing it down a rat hole down there when you send it down to Macedonia and Kosovo. Of course, the other side of the coin is the Kosovars and the Macedonians were saying, look, we are very poor down here. We have very few assets. We need to bolster our economy. We need investment, and it should go here. So this was an economic problem. It's a big problem. Should you invest in a place that's undeveloped to try and develop it? Or should you invest in a place that's developed because it's more efficient to do that and you get better use out of your money? It's not an easy question. But in Yugoslavia, it became not only tinged, it became almost fundamentally an ethnic question. You Croats are trying to screw us. You Albanians are bleeding us dry, and so forth. Well, the resurgence of Albanian interest in Kosovo in the period of the 1980s, 70s and 80s, brought a lot of young people to the university. This is a volatile kind of thing to happen. Young people going to a university, thousands, tens and tens of thousands of them, getting their degree and not finding a job. This is not good. You don't want educated, unemployed men, 25 years old, wandering around without jobs. This is a revolutionary situation. And in fact, it turned out to be a revolutionary situation. And to make a complex story simplified, in 1981, the Albanians began. There was, by the way, I should mention a constitutional change in Yugoslavia, in all the socialist Yugoslavia, 1974, which raised the level of Kosovo. It didn't take it out of Serbia, but it raised the level to almost, practically speaking, the level of a republic. So that had most of the privileges of a republic, but not the name. And in the 1980s, agitation began, 1970s, agitation began among the Albanians for to be named a republic. In 1981, there was a kind of a revolt there. It was put down by force by the Serbs. Martial law was imposed. And we have the beginning of all of those events that led toward the Milosevic coming to power in 1987. Albanians being hostile to communism and hostile to Serbs. The Yugoslav government imposing itself, and I say Yugoslav here, not Serbian, because the leadership in Serbia, up until Milosevic took power, knew that there was a problem in Kosovo, knew there was a minority and nationality issue, but they believed it was a Yugoslav problem, that it was a problem for the whole country, and they also believed the only way it could be dealt with was by negotiation, in some kind of peaceful way. Tension, yes, but not force. Milosevic had a different idea. He thought the Kosovo problem was a Serbian problem, not a Yugoslav problem, and that it could be dealt with by force. He came to power in 1987, changed the constitution of Serbia in 1989 and taking away many of the former rights of Albania. The Albanians essentially revolted against this, and martial law was declared again, this time by the Serbs. And we're now coming into the 90s and the breakup of Yugoslavia. So that's a kind of a quick thumbnail sketch of the position of Kosovo in the Yugoslav situation and in relationship to Serbia. Now, if you put these two situations together, one, the idea of nationalists, the fact that nationalism, in my opinion, is a powerful mobilizing and legitimating idea, which is based on notions of the French Revolution that we actually believe in: popular sovereignty, equity, freedom, but just shifted, transformed in a little way, in a certain specific kind of way, to be treated as community kind of ideas within a state system. You take that, and you take the kind of hostility that developed between the Serbs and the Croats, between the Serbs and the Albanians living in Kosovo during the socialist period, and you have an extremely volatile and difficult situation. You have, to look at it from our point of view, an essentially insoluble problem, because you have both sides of the issue basing their arguments on principles that we believe in. We believe in both of these principles. The first one is the principle of self-determination of peoples. This is popular sovereignty. Woodrow Wilson, probably most of us do believe that people should have the choice to live in what kind of state, in the kind of state that they wish. That this is a fundamental kind of modern idea. Self-determination of peoples. That's what the Kosovars, or the Albanians in Kosovo, say. On the other side of the coin, we also are pretty sure we don't want to see borders changed by force. This is not only just an idea we have, but it's a principle of the Helsinki Agreements of 1975 that has been very powerfully adhered to by all European states. It is considered illegitimate in international law these days and accepted by all who signed this agreement, which are all the European states, to change borders by force. Now, in Yugoslavia, when it collapsed, a little fudge was made there to say that, well, okay, there were 6 republics there, and we're not going to change those borders. Yugoslavia collapsed, but we're not going to change those republican borders, but we're going to keep those, as we are attempting to do in Bosnia, for example. So we probably believe in that principle, too. It's not a good idea to change borders by force. That's the Serbian idea. Their argument is very simple. It's ours. That's it. It's ours. And we're going to keep it. And we don't want people coming in here and telling us what to do in a place that's ours. It goes against the idea of sovereignty, which has been a basic principle of European states for 300 years, and which every other international entity accepts: the sovereignty of the nation state, the sovereignty of the state. And that's what the Serbs say, that we're doing that. It's our country, and we're defending it. So these are two principles that are irreconcilable. They're basically irreconcilable. But there are some lessons, I think, to be learned from the kind of analysis I've sketched out, or attempted to sketch out here. One of them is that economic sanctions don't work. We know this anyway, because we've tried them a lot, and they don't work. But the reason is that nationalism has nothing to do with economics. The state system was created prior to or parallel to capitalism. It's not necessarily directly related to capitalism and industrialization. The French Revolution is ideologically separate in many ways from the Industrial Revolution, despite the fact that we often lump them together as the dual revolution. And nationalism really is not interested in those kinds of issues, so that sanctions just don't work. It's not a surprise that Serbia has been able to undergo privation because of the economic sanctions. It's not a surprise at all, because that's not what's motivating intellectually, at least, if we can give Milosevic credit for intellectualism. I don't know if we can, but intellectually, at least, that's one of the reasons. A second thing, I just said that the basic Serbian argument is that it's ours. I think one thing we've underestimated here, and is the strength with which Serbs hold to the idea of Kosovo. I see, and you still see it in this bombing raid in the bombing situation, it's the position of the U.S. government and of NATO that we're not bombing the Serbian people. We don't want to harm the Serbian people. We only want to get Milosevic to accept an international agreement. We're just dissatisfied with him, not the Serbian people. Actually, this offends Serbs greatly because, especially now that the bombing has started, they are very strongly believe in his position of holding on to Kosovo. This is not something Milosevic invented. He has intensified it. He's brought it to a fever pitch where it didn't exist at that pitch, say, in 1980. And he has used it for his own political ends. But it is a real sensation and a real feeling. One of the worst events, the worst problems of the outcomes, or temporary outcomes, I hope, of the bombing is that it has solidified the opposition intellectuals and young people and so forth in Belgrade again, who oppose Milosevic, and has solidified them behind him. Because, as would happen here, if somebody were bombing us, every conservative in the Republic in the world would line up behind Clinton, even though they hate him, because we're being attacked. It's something like that happens. Maybe not every single one, but maybe not any of them, right? But in any event, it's quite clear that Milosevic has deep popular support, and even with the opposition that he has had there, which has not been able to come together, he has, even without them, even if they remain opposed, he would continue to have this deep popular support. This is a long-term problem. It's a long-term process. It's not something that is unique to the Balkans. It is a European process. It's not something special. It should therefore be analyzed in terms of that process. And so instead of thinking of the Balkans as some place where bizarre things are happening, tribal rivalries and people killing each other for thousands of years and that kind of thing, what we need to do is look at this last 150 years of how Europeans have solved or not solved, or what the methodology they've used to solve the question of remapping state lines onto ethnic borders. And now perhaps a little conclusion, or at least a statement about solutions. I don't have any solutions for the short-term problem. We are in a very, very difficult no-win situation here. Whatever happens, NATO and the United States government will be criticized because there is no right way to do this. There is no right situation that we are in today. But there is, in my opinion, a long-range solution, and that is, as I've said several times here, to remap state lines onto ethnic communities. Now, when I have thought about this in the past, before these last few weeks, when I was thinking particularly about Kosovo, I was thinking about remapping. You know, academics, we sit down around a table, we get out the map, and we draw a line, around the map and say, okay, this will be Albania, this will be Serbia. That's remapping. But of course, historically, that's not how it happened. Although, there is a wonderful story about Tehran Conference in 1943 when Stalin and Churchill were meeting to discuss the future of Poland. Staff work was not very good in those days. They couldn't find a map. And so somebody went out and got an issue of the Times, from London, with a little map about this big in there. And they looked at it, and they let in Stalin, and it took a red pencil and went like that, down the map. And Churchill said, that looks pretty good. And that's basically the line that ended up pretty close to that line. Anyway, so that's remapping. That's really remapping. But what's really remapped Europe is tremendous violence. Tremendous violence and bloodshed. 50 million people dead in World War II, World War I and World War II. Not all for this purpose, but that was one of the outcomes. And unfortunately, I see no other way to do that in the Balkans today except by violence. And I doubt seriously if we want to get involved in that violence by sending troops on the ground for many reasons. But the solution when it comes, the remapping when it comes, will not be by people sitting around and drawing a map, although that may be an eventual outcome. It will be by people being remapped, people changing. So that what's happening in Kosovo with the pushing out of these persons is not unusual it's not an unusual European event. It's happened many times. It's in the grand European tradition of bloody remapping, if you want to call that grand. This is something I think Europeans have forgotten, the violent background of their own stability today. And it's unfortunately going to continue there. It doesn't give me any policy insights. Oh, it might, but the policy insight is very distasteful, extremely distasteful. A policy insight might be to say, oh, all right, the Serbs have pushed most of the Albanians, not most, but maybe half of the Albanians out of Kosovo. We should stand back and let that stand. That's a very unpalatable thing, and not only unethical, but probably politically unpopular. I actually have a lot more faith in the good sense, common sense of the American public than a lot of the pundits and politicians and poll takers have. I believe that the sites they have seen on television has mobilized a good substantial amount of public opinion, whether it's measured in the polls or not, in favor of doing something about this. This is why, in my opinion, Milosevic has stopped the flow, as he did yesterday, of immigrants. He's now, in my view, beginning a diplomatic campaign to sow discord among the Western Alliance. There's already obviously always a certain amount of discord. I mean, what is it, 19 countries now, I think, something like that, in NATO. Plus you have the Russians lurking off there. Don't forget, they have 6,000 or however many it is. 7? Who's counting? 7,000. 6,000 or 7,000 nuclear warheads. This is not something we want to fool around with. It's a very complicated and difficult situation. We don't want to reward Milosevic, whom we see as perpetrating war crimes. So I'm not happy with the possible political or policy orientation of my analysis. But all I have said in past lectures before I had to deal with reality here is that however this remapping comes, it will come and it will be violent. And I think our only hope is to try and find some, if we believe that might happen, our only way to create stability is by creating these compact, ethnically homogeneous states, but our task is to do all we can to lessen the human cost of these tragic and difficult adjustments. If we can do that, then we will have served our situation and our time well. So thank you. Before I open the floor for questions, I'd like to take a book out of listserv things and so forth and answer a couple of what are known as frequently asked questions. Okay? One of the questions, Tito must have been really great, man. We miss Tito. He really held these people down. You're right. He did. He was a dictator who ruled a single party state, and when nationalist ideas emerged, he crushed them. But that's like putting a Band-Aid over the sore without doing anything to the sore. And you take the Band-Aid off, and what you notice that it's gotten gangrenous, And that's what happened in Yugoslavia. Here's another question. Well, is there some time we could have done something about this? Where would there a judicious application of force? I believe there was. It was October, November 1991 when the Serbian or Montenegrin forces were bombarding Dubrovnik. I said before, probably people in this room have been to Dubrovnik. It's an absolutely fantastic, marvelous late medieval city. I don't know if it's unique, but it's close to it, right on the Adriatic there. And they were purposely bombing the archives and places like that. This was in October, November 1991. And I actually wrote an op-ed piece saying at the time that this is a place where we should intervene. It would have been militarily cheap. It would have sent an extremely powerful message, but we didn't. Why didn't we do it? It's because when the breakup of Yugoslavia occurred, the Europeans, just flush from the collapse of communism, the unification of Germany, Germans were particularly strong about this, but others too, said, Yugoslavia, we can deal with it. This is our problem. We don't need you Americans here, we can do it. And the Bush administration, of course, was very happy to have them say that. They didn't want to get involved in some kind of Balkan events. There was something else that happened, too. And I know from talking to people in the National Security Council that that this was definitely their policy. They were not thinking at all about doing something in Yugoslavia. They thought it would be a snake pit, which it has turned out to be. But something else happened, too, that solidified that, and that was, maybe some of you remember this, in Pennsylvania, there was a by-election for Senate in which a man named Wofford beat the Republican nominee, former Attorney General, who had a 40-point lead when the race started, but Wofford beat him in an election early November 1991. How come he beat him? Because he said basically, what we need is a social program. We have to look to the United States, forget these foreign adventures. We have to concentrate on our own affairs. And he won the election. I was in Washington at that time. It was like an electric shock went through Washington. Big lights went on. It said, Bush can be beaten. And everybody got excited. Bush canceled a trip to Japan or put it off. Under these circumstances, there was no way we were going to do that. But it was a moment where I think we could have sent a strong message. It would have been backed up perhaps with a couple other stronger messages to follow, but it was at least someplace. A third question. Did American bombing really solve the problem in Bosnia? No, it didn't. It added to a situation that the Croats had created by, with our kind of winking and blinking and so forth, help, permitted them to defeat the Serbs in Krajina and in a couple of other places. And then we added the bombing to that, and then the Serbs under Milosevic were brought to Dayton, where after tremendous pressure and almost failure, they signed the Dayton Agreement for Bosnia. But, as you might imagine, if you take my analysis to have anything to it, you will know that I believe there is no light at the end of the multi-ethnic tunnel in Bosnia. It's not going to work. Very little. If you ask somebody from the State Department today, well, how's it going in Bosnia? Do you see the light at the end of the tunnel? They'll kind of nod and say, yes, of course, things are improving marginally, of course, slowly. If you talk to them then at the bar later, they say, it's terrible. We're not going anyplace there. And it's not working, the multi-ethnic state. We are Americans. A recent idea of ours is multi-ethnic. It's quite recent, really, in the United States. It used to be the melting pot and so forth. But we have tried to impose that for good reasons. We don't want to change the big border of Bosnia and so forth. It's not working, and something, I don't know when, I don't know exactly how, but something's going to happen there too. We can't keep troops there for 100 years. Although we've done it in Cyprus, so maybe we can do it there for all I know. Okay, I'd be glad to answer a couple questions for, yeah.
One question from
Yes.
the overflow room.
Yes.
Legitimacy of NATO actions. From the international law point of view, how would you evaluate the legality of NATO actions, particularly with regard to the UN Charter, Article 2, the NATO Charter, and the 1980 Vienna Convention and Law of Treaties?
Fortunately, I am not an international lawyer, and therefore I can't really answer that question. I do know that in general, however, international law is useful to those who are victorious in things, and not so useful to those who aren't. And I really can't answer that question on a technical basis. I'm sorry to say. Yes.
I'd like to, I guess, challenge your assumption, perhaps, that the multi-ethnic state won't work at all. One of the things, I promise I'll put this in a question, but I think one of the things that Milosevic did was deliberately destroy any notion that sort of the multi-ethnic state existed over the past 300 years. I mean, they deliberately bombed and just eradicated any...
Yeah. Okay, this is a good point, because in fact Bosnia was for a long time a multi-ethnic state, and although there are hostilities, there are hostilities in Houston between the ethnic groups. It's just that we have an established civil society and system that kind of keeps them under control, and we have a certain amount of rule of law and so forth. And in Bosnia, this is the thrust, I think, of the argument of a number of people who have written books about Bosnia lately, that for a long time they have been a multi-ethnic state that more or less got along and didn't have these tremendous outpourings of problems. And you talked to people from Sarajevo today who have left, and they'll say things like, my father was a Serb, my mother was a Croat, my husband is Jewish. What is my daughter? You know, maybe 30% were intermarriages, especially in the urban parts. At least maybe 30% were interethnic marriages. And you read things like people will say, I went to high school with these people. I just wasn't really clear whether they were Serb or Croat until the war. And the war, Serb position on the war is that they felt threatened by people that they had done genocidal acts against them in Croatia and in Bosnia in World War II. It's a fact that those things did happen. But those things were not happening in 1990 and 1991. There was tension and what have you, but I think more extreme Serbian nationalists drove those events beyond what I would call reasonable reaction to the situation. And so I would agree with you that the Serbs are the ones who took ethnic conflict in Bosnia to the extreme of vicious ethnic cleansing, Srebrenica and many other places like this. It's not that there weren't some atrocities by others, there were. But I think you're correct in saying that the Serbs, by and large, were the ones who undermined and destroyed the multi-ethnic character of Bosnia. Maybe this side of the room, yes.
I have a question about decision-making. I think in your presentation... Yeah. I have a question about decision-making. In your presentation, you've developed this historical perspective and went way back in time. And if you think about what President Clinton's responsibilities are, or how he's got to interface with all this, I think decision-making, may be measured in terms of hours or days or weeks. And could you comment on that?
Let me tell you an anecdote. I was teaching a course in 1995. It was on the Balkans, and there were something like 14 people in the class. One of them was a Croat. And at that time, this is when the Croats were pushing the Serbs out of the Krajina, and there was a moment there, just at the right time in my course, when the Croats were considering the possibility of attacking the city of Banja Luka. This would have had tremendous consequences one way or another, but the debate was going on whether they should attack the city of Banja Luka. So I posed a question to my class. They were kind of informed about this by now, and we were dealing with it. So there's a discussion. Yes, this would have this consequence. No, it should have that consequence. And so finally we took a vote. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I'll make them up. 6 people voted yes, they should do it. 6 people voted no, they shouldn't. And 1 abstained. Who abstained? The Croat. And I said, wait a minute, why are you abstaining? You know more about this than anybody here. He says, yes, but I don't have enough information. This is the problem that every decision maker has. Not enough information and no foresight. You don't know what the issue, how it's going to turn out. This is why a lot of the political criticisms of decisions that are made in good faith at a certain time are so specious and so obviously tawdry that they don't take into account the changeableness of events and the time pressure that people are under. You just have to decide things, right or wrong, when they happen. And it's very, very difficult, and you need a little bit of luck as well as a lot of skill and knowledge, but what can I say? I mean, it's a very, very tough kind of thing to happen.
Yes, here.
Yes.
My country is neighboring Yugoslavia, and I was watching the conflict with interest. And I can see that the media is presenting only one side of the coin. I never read anything about the terrorists, KLA. I don't know what they mean. But if you name them terrorists, they must do something, and the media doesn't write anything about this.
From Macedonia, or?
Well, the KLA are in Kosovo.
Yes.
I'm from Romania.
From Romania, yeah.
Yes, and
so you're saying that we are not covering the KLA?
I don't know anything about them, but I'm just curious because if you know them terrorists, they must do something, and I cannot read anything in the media.
Yeah.
And the second issue is that before this conflict, American government and West Europeans, they agree with that the borders are independent, are untouchable.
Yeah.
And I see now, after a few days, a change in opinion that, well, we may reshape the borders, and I'm looking to my country and I see a conflict in the future, and I'm not happy with this at all.
Yeah.
And
let me
look
say
that
something
you
about
change
this.
the politics in a few weeks. I mean,
Let me say something about the
Very-
second question. I mean, I can understand your nervousness about the possibility of difficulties in Transylvania concerning Romanians and Hungarians and so forth. And I agree with you that there does seem to be kind of floating around out there a different sensibility about perhaps partitioning or somehow redrawing borders in Kosovo. It's my personal opinion, being far from the scene, of course, but having thought about it a little, is that the kind of thing that's happening in Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia will not have a similar kind of impact in Hungary. I've been I should say, in Romania with the Hungarians. I think there has been an enormous improvement, this is my view at least, in the relations between Hungary and Romania in the last 5 years or so. I think that's encouraging. It's not going to be an easy problem to deal with, but I'm hoping that at least it doesn't seem at this point to me to have the same kind of ferocity that events in Yugoslavia. As far as the KLA is concerned, let me just say something about that. And I remember talking with friends of mine who are very knowledgeable about Yugoslavia, say 1995, 1996 in there, that time period, and we expressed great admiration for Mr. Rugova and others like him, who had created in Albania, I should say in Kosovo, a kind of a shadow government, a shadow educational system when the Serbs took over basically the administration and educational system and what have you of Kosovo after Milosevic's successes in 1989, because they were nonviolent. And we admired that very much. I remember a number of conversations on this. I just thought this is wonderful that he is able to do this. There was two problems with the nonviolent approach. First, it had no effect. The Western powers didn't pay any attention to it. Maybe like me, oh, it's admirable, but obviously we don't have to do anything here. There's no crisis. Second is, and many times we talked about this back in those days. He says someday there's going to come along some young men with guns who are not going to want to wait anymore. We can't wait. We can't go on like this. And they are going to start something. And that's what happened. The KLA came along and decided we want independence and we're going to fight for it. That happened about 1997, and they got stronger and stronger in 1997, 98, and 99. And from their point of view, they're like a liberation army. They call themselves Liberation Army, sort of like the Algerians, for example, or the Vietnamese, or whoever, under communist ideas, were liberation armies against colonialism in post-World War II period. That they see themselves in the same way. But also in these conversations, we agreed that the reason that Rugova was doing what he was doing because he knew that the Serbs grossly outgunned the Albanians, and that if there was a armed uprising, the Serbs would wipe them out, or maybe not wipe them out, but do something like they're doing now. It's just not unexpected what has happened here, and I think all of us felt that when those KLA came on the scene, that it was only a matter of time before some terrible crisis erupted there. And of course, unlike Rugova, the KLA has gotten international participation at a horrible cost to their own people. But if it turns out that NATO and the United States were to bring military force to bear, ground troops to bear there, and decided to bite the bullet and go ahead, then the KLA policy would have proven at great cost, as these things I've said are always bloody, will have been proven correct if they get Kosovo back somehow. I don't think they will, but at least that's seems to me, their strategy. I would say they are a normal, if there's such a thing, liberation army like in post-war colonial situation.
With the war between the states, we showed that you can have a jolly little civil war without ethnic differences, just economic, or primarily economic. How much of the tension is economic in Yugoslavia?
Very little, practically none, as it was in my untutored opinion in the Civil War. Civil War was not about economics, it was about slavery. It's taught in high schools. We have John Bowles sitting here. I've talked with him a lot about this. And it's taught in high schools today basically a lot, as John has told me, and he can correct me later when I say the wrong thing here, but not in public, please, John, but later. That although that's taught that way in high schools, it's not taught that way anymore in universities because it's perceived today as being not true, that the war is really about slavery. And this war in Kosovo, in my opinion, has nothing to do with economics. How can it have something to do with economics when one of the outcomes of the war is to destroy half your country? A good example of this happened in 1991 in Yugoslavia before it broke up. I thought in the spring of 1991, Yugoslavia can't break up. Listen, I had statistics. There were 2,800 or whatever it was international agreements signed with corporations and all around Yugoslavia for various things. They hadn't necessarily got the money in there yet, but I mean, they were in the process. The IMF and other international banking agencies were ready to give Yugoslavia $4 billion worth of loans. There's a lot of money for them at that time. And I thought to myself, gee, there's too much at stake here. Well, right. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Oh, I don't know. Where are we at? Over. Sorry.
What do you think about the effectiveness of the current NATO attacks? Don't you think that the current NATO action on Yugoslavia and the bombings are a decision that was very much rushed, and does it produce the results in short term or in the long term that could be justified by from a humanitarian aspect or from political aspect, or
Okay.
from other consequences of NATO standing on one side in this such a conflict?
Well-
Will NATO intervene later in Croatia if the Serbs start a war, or in Bosnia if the Serbs ask
No,
for
I think
independence, or in
that there's
Macedonia?
that's a illegitimate kind of domino thesis, because these things always are specific and particular on how they work. As far as rushing the bombing, actually, I don't think it was very rushed. It took a long time, and it was a kind of a slow process of efforts and negotiation. I remember seeing a cartoon in the newspaper some time ago. I can't state the exact date, and it showed a NATO bomber, and down there's Milosevic looking up, and there's a thing coming out of the bomb bay, and it says "stern threat" on it. I mean, there came a point. We have been giving stern threats to Milosevic since 1991. And only in a couple of events have we, in 1995, for example, but usually we have not really taken a final measure. It came to the point, because of accumulation of efforts that didn't work out, that finally I think the NATO partners felt that if we're going to have any credibility anywhere again, we are eventually going to have to do this. And you're absolutely right about what might be called collateral costs. One interesting one that just read about in the New York Times this morning is that the bridges are down in the Danube. What does that mean? Does that hurt Serbia? Well, a little bit, not much. Who does it hurt? Romania? Hungary? Why? Because trade is going up and down that Danube River. It's just full of ships all the time going between Romania and Hungary. And they're the ones that are going to be hurt, along with Bulgaria and Austria. Not so much Serbia. It's kind of a collateral cost. And that's an economic one, not a humanitarian, which of course a lot of humanitarian costs too, so I agree. But that's what you know is going to happen when you start a war. I'd like to say I'll take two more questions. Do you have one that you want, or do you have a choice? Oh, you have the microphone. Okay, that indicates you.
Yeah, I'd like your opinion. I've read the following interpretation, namely, for Milosevic's actions, and that was that if he had signed the accords, he was effectively giving away Kosovo, and he would have been sunk politically. Whereas if NATO takes it away from him, then in effect he'll be a hero, having stood up for.
Yeah, well, I especially agree with the first part, that as I said before, the popular support for keeping Kosovo and Serbia is very strong and very emotional, and this is something that is not perceived as a Milosevic policy so much, the idea of keeping Kosovo, but as a Serbian national necessity. They speak of Jerusalem in phrases like that. So I agree that he felt that he couldn't do that. As far as whether he's calculating that if NATO takes it away from him, he will still be perceived as a hero, I couldn't say, but I do know that besides being a bad guy, he's a hell of a politician. And he has managed to lie and outmaneuver and outtalk and outweight the Western Alliance now for 10 years. And it seems right now that what he's doing, by the way, you know, yesterday, I forgot if I mentioned this or not, but yesterday he stopped sending troops. I mean, he stopped letting refugees across the border. What would be a possible rationale for that? Well, there's a number of kind of military ones. Well, he'll herd, as the word they use, the refugees around military objects so that they can't be bombed and things like that. But I think he's clever in that. He would just as soon see all the television pictures about refugees hanging around the Macedonian border and so forth disappear from Western television, because he believes, I'm making this up, what do I know what he believes, but he could easily believe that that once that happens, interest in the West in this is going to wane. And what he would like to do is start to sow some discord among these entities. So one of the secrets of a good strategist is not to show your cards. And I think one doesn't know what his cards are, but you want to keep your hands on the table, his hands on the table, because it's likely to be an interesting situation. Okay, here's somebody. Last question. I'm sorry, but time marches on.
This is basically a technical question. I noticed that you and the rest of the media are referring to the former Yugoslavic Republic of Macedonia as Macedonia, and the name happens to be very contested, highly contested at this point between Greece and
yes.
Fyrom. And I noticed that Jamie Shee, the NATO spokesperson, was I think the only person that I've heard thus far that has referred to Fyrom as Fyrom, the official name that's in the United Nations Charter. And I was wondering what your take is on that, and also whether you think that that might spark conflict in the future, since it is still disputed, hasn't been...
This is the question over what is the proper name to call what is technically called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which is the name by which Macedonia has joined the United Nations. The reason that it has that name instead of just plain ordinary Macedonia is that when a number of reasons, but one of them is that when Macedonia was split up from the Turks, from the Ottomans, I should say, in 1912 and 1913, more than half of the geographic area known as Macedonia went to Greece. 35% went to, if I got my figures right, or 30% or something went to Serbia, and 15% went to Bulgaria. So that the area known in modern times as Macedonia, a good half of it is in Greece. This is not to mention the ancient Macedonia of Alexander and so forth. So the Greeks have a very strong feeling about Macedonia as theirs. Macedonia is theirs. And therefore they objected heartily, in my opinion, kind of irrationally, but nevertheless they objected heartily to the idea that this new place, this new country from the breakup of Yugoslavia should be called Macedonia. And therefore, after lengthy negotiations, difficult negotiations, change of the flag that Macedonia had adopted and so forth, it was finally accepted into the United Nations with the official name of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And I would think that a formal public official for NATO would probably want to refer to it with that title because, after all, Greece is a member of NATO, right? And so they're sensitive to the sensibilities of Greece. But as far as people just appearing on TV and so forth, I think it's perfectly understandable why they would just say Macedonia,
Could I just ask you something?
No. I do want to say one thing. Here, I just want to point something out to you. It has nothing to do with this, with Macedonia. It has to do with Kosovo. I'll just mention it. There are two ways to say the word Kosovo. One is Kosovo, which ends with an O. And this is what you'll see on the screens when they say the Kosovo crisis or whatever. And the other way is Kosovo, which is the Albanian pronunciation. It ends with an A, Kosovo. what's very interesting to me is that whereas a lot of people on TV announcing this will say Kosovo, because that's sort of the traditional name. If you listen to Sandy Berger or President Clinton, they say Kosovo. They don't say Kosovo, but they say Kosovo. They end with an A. This is the Albanian writing of the term. I don't know what that means, but it means something. It means that the Kosovars are getting a lot more sympathy than they were some time ago. It's a little kind of thing you can look at. When the New York Times starts writing Kosovo instead of Kosovo, you'll know that the progress of making Kosovo into an autonomous or independent state is probably inching further along. Thanks a lot, everybody.